like what new language for weather.
Like nor'easter. Yeah.
Exactly. So I think we're getting a foot of snow on Saturday morning or something, which actually sounds delightful. It's like not during.
When it comes all at once, it's kind of beautiful, I think.
That's right. That's
very
right.
peaceful. I like going for a walk right after and everything's just quiet.
Same. Yeah, it's true.
Oh, wow. Okay. All right. Well, Sarah, I think we'll get started. As I said, we made a little adjustment here because no one braved the cold. So the room I have the room. I am completely socially distanced. It's Matt, who's about 12 feet away, and me. And then we have all these lovely people online, and I'm sure there'll be a bunch of folks actually. In fact, we heard from some of them that they'll be watching on YouTube. So let me just start with just a quick welcome. So welcome to everybody who is joining us online. It's wonderful to have you here. I'm so thankful for this kind of technology that allows us to connect with each other, particularly when it's really cold, but especially, and I'll talk about this in just a minute, to bring in folks who can speak into our lives in unique ways, but maybe they're not local. And Sarah, you're definitely not local right now. You're all the way out on the East Coast. So this is, tonight is our event is a faith and forum, and it's faith and humanities is the focus. And the faith and forums, we typically have these once a month, and they will focus on particular kinds of issues. We have some that where we focus on faith and justice, faith in the environment. Faith in the humanities was particularly conceived because of the churches and kind of communities of faith, both Christian, Muslim, and Jewish, and probably others as well. Their long interactions and engagements with significant questions about life. That being a person of faith or a person of conviction, however you want to put that, is not something that is sequestered. To be sequestered, it's something to be lived out. We want to have an integrated life and an integrated faith. So that's what the Faith and Humanities Forums are for. Tonight, I'm particularly delighted to welcome our speaker, who actually is a dear friend from back in the day. I was trying to think, I think we met in, I think it was 1994 or 95, I can't remember. But it was through the Hermans and Peter and the whole Wheaton crew that sort of migrated out to Boston right around the same time that I wound up moving up there. My wife, Julie, we all kind of got to know each other, and Julie reminded me when I was telling her that we were going to be inviting you, that you and Sara Hendren through was it the first, or I mean, I think it was the first baby shower for our oldest son, Jonah.
Yes.
Who's about to turn 25.
Yes.
Time flies, right?
Which means we are approximately 1,000 years old.
There you go. That's right. That's right. Well, I would like to I just wanted to make sure that folks knew that she's just a dear person, and I just think it's one of the most curious, thoughtful, intellectually reflective, engaged people that I've had the pleasure of knowing. Wonderful husband as well, who is a documentary filmmaker. So I'd like to read a few comments here to introduce you, Sarah, to folks who don't know about your work. And I'm just going to draw some material basically off of your website. Sara Hendren is an artist, a design researcher, writer, and professor at Olin College of Engineering, which is out in the Boston area. She's the author of What Can a Body Do? How We Meet the Built World. I think I have my copy here. Yes, great book. We have copies here at church. If you're interested in picking one up, I really highly recommend it. It was chosen as a Best Book of the Year by NPR, won a Science and Society Journalism Award, and an honors recognition in the Massachusetts Book Awards. Sara is a humanist in tech, and I'm sure she'll explain a little bit of what that means in her talk. During the period from 2010 to 2020, She engaged in several collaborative public art and social design, writing projects, etc., in an attempt to think about and reframe how the human body interacts with technology. And there are several projects that you can kind of check out on her website. I can just list a couple: a lectern for short stature, a ramp for wheelchair dancing, a navigational king that plays music, and of course the one that I think the first time that I was like, oh, that's what she's doing now, a street art effort, really was kind of guerrilla art, I guess, that became the Accessible Icon Project, which is really cool. Her work has been exhibited on the White House lawn under the Obama administration, at the Victoria and Albert Museum, the Dock Center for Contemporary Art, the Vitra Design Museum, the Seoul Museum of Art, among many other venues. And she also has work that's held in permanent collections at the Museum of Modern Art and the Cooper Hewitt Museum. She's been a national fellow at the New America think tank, and her work has been supported by an NEH public grant, residences including at places like the Yaddo and Carey Institute for Global Good, and an artist fellowship from Massachusetts Cultural Council. She lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where she's coming to speak to us. She lives there with her husband and 3 children. And tonight she is going to be talking to us. Her talk is titled, When Our Bodies Meet Technology. So without further ado, I want to turn it over to you, Sara.
Thank you so much, Christian. And it's so good to be here at Colonial Church, especially as the guest of Julie and Christian, who are dear, dear people to me. And I'm just more aware than ever in a pandemic what old friendships mean in our lives. And so I know churches form those things. That's how our friendship was formed originally, really, in a body of church goers. And so I join you today and happy to have the dialogue about faith and the humanities, faith and culture, faith indeed and technology. All of that is alive in my work and in my life, and the ways that those intersections actually draw up the most essential questions for all of us. That is to say, what is a life worth living? How do we construct that? What are our human needs for assistance, and where do those fall in that good, desirable life and the common good? So I want to share some images with you, because it is a talk about that's a lot about design, and then just pose some questions and ideas and some stories that I'll tell, some of which appear in the book and some of which don't, and some just more kind of vivid material examples. And then I'll come back and would love to talk with you about whatever is on your minds. What I find is that this topic of disability that kind of organizes today is inevitably present in everyone's life at some point in the lifespan. And so you may be thinking about aging parents, you may be thinking about changes in your own body, you may be thinking about friends and loved ones with new diagnoses or with questions about their own health. And so this topic, I find, gathers us in a strong way, no matter who we are. So let me just share, if I can. I just wanted to point out too, I don't know if you all know this about Zoom, but at the bottom of your screen should be a little icon that says CC for closed caption and live transcript. That's enabled. And if you click on it, to show those subtitles, you'll see what is a profound, actually, development in AI-assisted technology, that is automated captions. And the fidelity is really quite good. So if you haven't used it before and want to test it out, that is a perfect example of what we'll be talking about tonight. All right, I'm gonna share this keynote, and Christian, if you can just give me a thumbs up that you're seeing the cover of my book. Okay. So Christian mentioned this is a book that I finished in 2020, and the cover, the design of the cover actually is kind of the question that hangs over my work and the book and this talk tonight, and that is the misfit between the size of that typeface and the real estate of the book. So is the type too big for that space of the book, or is the book too small to contain it? And it's not clear where the misfit lies, which one of those things should move its properties to fit better. And that is, again, a question that I've been thinking about, especially for the last 10 years as the mother of a child with Down syndrome and the aunt to a niece with autism and just a number of atypicalities in my family, but also thinking about that in a professional context too. And it remains the most generative and interesting question that I can think of. I'm coming to you tonight from Olin College, which is an all engineering college in Needham, Massachusetts, so outside Boston. We have a new president, Gilda Barabino, there on the right. All of our students get engineering degrees of various kinds, robotics, mechanical, computing, and we have 350 students total on campus at any one time. So we're a tiny little place, like a laboratory school for rethinking engineering education. So students do a lot of this activity that I'm showing you on the right? They do a lot of problem sets, they do a lot of mathematics, they do a lot of working out of theoretical problems by analysis, the way you do in math and science. But fundamentally, of course, engineering is applied. It is the built stuff that we make. It's the prototyping, it's the trial and error, it's the principles of science in built stuff, interacting in messy ways in the world of our lives, right? So it is much more than the abstraction on the right. It is this building and builder culture there on the left. And it is also profoundly, getting students out into the world and asking people about their lives, about their wishes, about their values, and about their needs, because of course, technology has no meaning unless it's in the very untechnological world of the places where we live, our homes and our kitchens and our workplaces. And so having students face up to that messiness and their assumptions and all of those misconceptions that we have about one another, that's a humanistic exercise after all. That is, how do we meet one another and try to find common cause for a world together? So that's kind of our context. And in that context, I teach, these two subjects where design, including engineering, but design at all scales, so wearable things, products, interiors and architecture, and also street planning, all of that encompassed in design, and where does it meet with disability? So people tend to think, I find, when we say engineering context, design, and disability, they tend to think of an image like this, that is a very high-end myoelectric prosthetic arm that comes from the laboratory, from sort of DARPA-funded, next level futuristic ideas of the replacement parts that would give us back the kind of functionality to our lives were we to lose some kind of function. And that's what's happening here. There's the simulacrum of the hand is being achieved by this technology, looking like a hand and fingers. And moreover, this wearer has a wedding ring on that prosthetic arm. So there's a prosthetic hand. So it feels like a replacement, not just of the function, but also of the identity. It's a really strong, persuasive story about prosthetic technology. And I've seen it be transformative in people's lives. It's something to celebrate. But the story actually it just explodes in interest and generativity and creativity from there. This is kind of one story that you'll hear about in the kind of gadget magazines, but it's really the tip of the iceberg in what is a lively field that involves all of us. So I want to just hang though on this idea of the story that's being told about prosthetics, because it gets so interesting and it's more complicated than we think. I find that people imagine, right, when they look at this, that maybe disability and design is about a kind of cyborg future, right? Like, oh, here are the machines to maybe take over, and they worry us a little bit, or they promise us a kind of victory over the body. They do this sort of like reassurance, like, well, the machines will step in, and we need not be bothered by an idea of frailty. That's one way people think about it. Or they think, well, maybe, and we'll talk about this tonight, oh, I see, right, prosthetics are about a kind of inclusion for disability. That is certainly part of the truth, absolutely. Or perhaps you've heard the term that's kind of proper in the field, which is assistive technologies. And it's a telling term. It's an idea that there are some technologies that do a special kind of help, for people who have non-normative bodies. That there are technologies kind of in the world, and then there are these special assistive technologies, and all of those tell us something about that strong, persuasive story that's being told. But I would say there's something actually more profound and more simple in the invitation that these two subjects are offering you tonight. And that idea is this, that prosthetics and assistive tech and design, the places where design and disability meet, actually invite all of us to rethink our relationship to help, to both giving it and receiving it. And it is what I notice is that a lot of people are very comfortable actually on the giving end of help, and that it often is the receiving end of help where we have trouble. We imagine ourselves weaker than we'd like. We dislike the vulnerability of that position. We imagine ourselves having to give up a kind of status when we cede our power and actually accept the help of others. And you can see this all over the way that prosthetics get talked about and the way we opt in or opt out at the moments when our bodies change. And so you'll hear stories tonight about people who help us rethink that relationship and invite us to a richer sense of what help can be, and indeed make assistance itself quite visible. And I want to argue tonight that assistance is in a desirable life and in a desirable future. And I think a lot of times we think of technologies and the clever gadgets and products in our lives as a way to make efficient what was messy before, as a way to clean up our needs for help and to sort of subsume them behind the slick technologies that we use, our phones and such. But I want to argue that there are some of the most exciting and interesting and deeply human technologies actually keep assistance visible and keep it in that lively future. And I think it's a future that we want, regardless of our relationship to disability. So that is the subject of this book. And I'll just tell you some of the stories that kind of flow from it. We could start by talking more about this kind of wearable kind of technology. So just the prosthetic arm, just this alone packs so many interesting histories. This is a man named Mike who became an amputee at age 14 and has been wearing a successive, more sophisticated kind of prosthetic arm. This is his fourth or fifth arm, each one kind of progressively better in the technology. That he uses every day, all the time. And so again, this is a story that you'd hear, quite celebrated, and it's worth celebrating. But you could also, and in this chapter called Limb in the book, we meet this man named Chris, who was born without one arm, had also 5 or 6 prosthetic arms provisionally built for him, but none of them were ever sufficient for his kind of needs. He was always so adaptive. Even as a toddler, he was born this way. It's the only body he knows. So for Chris, the prosthesis that's the right kind at just the right time is actually something you'll never see in Wired magazine, because it's this little contraption of, felted wool and yarn and just a little holster for doing this very particular job, which is changing his newborn baby's diaper. And what this contrast does is just reminds us that you all must know these people too, who are tinkerers in their everyday, in their living rooms and in their garages, adapting and remaking their own worlds for their bodies to do the kinds of things that they want to get done. And what would we do, looking at each of these men? What would we do? What will we do when our bodies change? What are the tools that we would ask from the world? And are we sure that they're the ones that would swoop in, like Mike's on the left, or might we think about these kind of simple changes on the right with Chris? Remember that prosthetics have this, incredible post-war history. All of the science of prosthetics is tied up in our own country with the National Science Foundation's rehabilitation engineering program. And that came, of course, when men like this were returning from World War II, having survived the field, but missing limbs. And so the National Science Foundation put all kinds of money and research dollars into rehabilitation engineering, not just for the functionality, again, just like with that wedding ring, but for the return, the recompense for the sacrifice that these folks had made. And so this deep sense of owing these men the best that money can buy. And so you'll see that still, that is an entire funding stream within the National Science Foundation. All those research dollars still are in that kind of same paradigm of rehabilitation, rehabilitating the body with the best tools that we can purchase, so that the self and the identity is returned. I mean, you see in Hollywood films in the post-war era, in 1950s and 60s, amputees, veterans depicted, having romantic relationships back in their civilian lives, also outfitted with tools and technologies, as a kind of reassurance to this whole generation that coming back with a different kind of body didn't have to mean the end of their lives. And there's all kinds of scholarship about the freight of that story and what it meant. What's interesting, though, is that the narrative isn't always like this, where you get a kind of rescue story of technology. So if you look at some of the images from Civil War veterans, right, not that long before, you'll actually see a lot of these empty sleeve images. So you'll see men posing proudly without the prosthetics that were available in that day. But here you have people opting out of those technologies precisely because to wear that emptiness was to actually display that same honor and valor of having sacrificed in the war. So whereas just a generation later, you would see the kind of opting into technologies, you in another time and place, in another culture, you might see opting out of technology. So it's this place where this is the kind of where technology and the humanities meet. It's a tool that's wed to a narrative perhaps in your personal life, or a narrative that's operating around you in your country, in the kind of national mythology that's taking place. So each of us is caught up in those same kinds of stories, consciously or unconsciously, about what kinds of tools we're putting on, and then what kind of self we're displaying, and which stories are we caught up in and want to be part of, what's our old story and our new story, et cetera. So you see that right up to the present day with these kinds of high-end technologies, again, like I showed you. But you will also find, if you are looking in the right place, a kind of expertise like Chris is on the right for the tool for doing just the right thing, which we'd never say is rehabilitative, I think. We wouldn't employ a really clinical idea that Chris somehow needs to be repaired or fixed by this prosthesis, when he's just rigged up the exactly right gadget at the right time to do what he needs to do, which is to care in an intimate way for his child. So that breaks open the whole story. You can look far and wide too, outside of the laboratories, at a place like the Jaipur Foot organization in India, which is all over India, fabricating low-tech prosthetic limbs, lower leg limbs, and distributing them for free all over India and South Asia. In this very robust and clever design. It's meant to be an all-terrain, kind of tool. So that myoelectric arm, replete with circuitry would be inappropriate here. I mean, this is the exactly right tool for this context. And again, economic distribution really matters when it comes to prosthetics. So you wouldn't, whereas the gadget magazines want to celebrate just the things that are coming out of the laboratory, in terms of computing and software mixed with hardware, here is a very robust mechanical model that, again, is getting to people who need it, who could not afford to purchase it, and it is widely distributed and manufactured in this networked way. So how would we account for the kind of impact that a design like this is having in the world if our attention is trained on that kind of cyborg story, or even purely rehabilitative, kind of engineering? The last story I'll tell, just in this kind of expanded view of prosthetics, is of this woman, Cindy, who's at the end of that limb chapter, who became a quadruple amputee at age 60. And so you see here that she lost most of the digits on both of her hands. And she also lost both of her lower leg limbs. That was really quite a different body to wake up in. And Cindy has good health insurance and qualified for and trained with this very myoelectric arm, much like Mike's, which again, is $80,000. It's the best that money can buy. She was lucky to get it, went and trained on it in a good faith kind of effort. But this tool is actually not giving her the kind of future that she wants. This is not the tool she uses. This sits in a closet. And meanwhile, there are all these little tools like this, like the rubber tubing that's around her eyeliner. That's actually what's making her everyday kind of possible. And more than that, there's all these clever adaptations like this peel and stick hook, like you would put on a wall in a dorm room, that she outfitted that hook on top of a cold cream jar or on top of a peanut butter jar in order to be able to turn it. That's the kind of prosthesis that we'd never recognize as a prosthesis, but is nonetheless the result of this deep thinking about what is my relationship to my surroundings? How can I get done the thing that I want to get done? And would we call it the kind of same ingenuity, creativity of technology as that other, very fancy lab produced arm? This is my favorite of Cindy's tools, this cap for writing with. So when Cindy realized that the myoelectric arm was not, she calls it her Darth Vader arm, and that it was not going to be the thing she wanted, she went back to her prosthetist and said, the thing I really miss doing is writing in my own handwriting thank you notes. That's something that I always did before. And remember, that smartphones are really great speech to text. Like, she doesn't have to write, but she really wanted to. And so they, for just pennies, in the back of the shop, the scraps of silicone, fashioned this cap to go over her residual limb and outfit it with a ballpoint pen. And this is her recognizable handwriting. This is a tool that she uses every day. So here again, Cindy, late in life, adapting, remaking her world in ways that are utterly invisible, but are an invitation to each of us to say, would we know? Would we know the kinds of activities we would want to do to feel like ourselves if and when our bodies changed? Could we see that there were actually openings and possibilities on offer to us and not just diminishment? And I think the story, the narrative that goes with disability tends to be one of diminishment, seeking a kind of replacement part in that one kind of frame, only the victory over the body. But meanwhile, there's this vast material culture of really interesting tools to make possible the things that make us feel integrated and like ourselves and familiar and even provisionally whole. So Cindy's is a story I always think of whenever my engineering students get really impressed by, the kind of latest innovation. I wanted to just mention too that I worked with an anthropologist colleague and Cindy to document all these innovations that she's done, all these little tools. And just last year, Olay came out with this adaptive cap for their cosmetics with those little wings there on the side so that you can turn the jar. I've not talked to anybody about whether this is working for them or not, but I just do think it's interesting how mass manufactured products do kind of, come around. And I have no idea if they've seen Cindy's design or anything, but it's just, it's a welcome change, right? Because this is hard for a lot of people, this kind of mobility. You don't have to have as dramatic a change as Cindy's to need that. So I guess, the argument here is for replacement parts for the things that matter to us. That is, not making a kind of ideal of the body that we would long for if and when our bodies change, but that we would understand all the tools doing that making and remaking work for us right now, and understanding that people with disabilities are actually at the forefront of remaking their own worlds, but not just in laboratories, also in living rooms, also in kitchens, also in workplaces, doing this kind of tinkering and fabrication, this deep, magical kind of adaptation of the body over and over and over, knitting together the world for its purposes. So ultimately, we'd say that disability, in the words of Rosemary Garland Thompson, is a condition of misfitting, she says, which sounds, kind of commonplace, but it's really profound when you think about it, because again, the misfit, it's not clear if our bodies are non-normal, if we're atypical and we feel like a misfit, it's actually not clear whether it's our job to come to the world and adapt ourselves and do all those kind of jump through all those hoops, or whether sometimes we can ask the world to come a little bit more toward our bodies. That's also been the history of disability rights, is to say the world is overly flexible, overly rigid, and could be more flexible in its structures. And that's a two-way street, that misfit. Where does the onus lie for what would make a more desirable world? And that's been the engine of such creativity. Remember, right, that all of our technology, this is, against that kind of narrative of special assistance, everything we use, everything you and I are using right now is technology and is therefore, by definition, offering us assistance. So we each live on a continuum with that same story of Cindy's. It's a different one. She has a very particular body, doing very particular adaptations. But there is a long line of continuum there between how you and I move through our worlds with our particular needs, always extended with stuff, extended with tools and technologies, some of which are from high-tech labs and some of which are really very simple indeed. But our bodies are assisted by their very nature. So a lot of folks in disability studies, including Rose Marie, who coined that term misfitting, would say that disability, that assistance and its arrival in our lives might be a fundamental fact of humanness, that need, that frailty, that fundamental vulnerability, and its need for extensions. So again, all of that is an invitation to reimagine your own relationship to help, giving and receiving. I'll just tell a few other stories, not at the site of prosthetics, but just in our other everyday worlds. All of these products here, which must be familiar to you, the Cuisinart food processor, the Aeron chair, and the OXO Good Grips kitchen hand tools, those all have an origin story in disability. They were each, the Cuisinart and the OXO, those were designed with arthritis in mind, so a better ergonomic, comfortable, squeezable handle in the OXO case, and the kind of flipping motion of those paddles as opposed to fiddly knobs in the case of the Cuisinart when it was redesigned for home use in the 70s. Both of those have their origin stories in aging and arthritis. Also, the Aeron chair was designed, it's now a high-end status chair kind of for Silicon Valley firms and stuff, but it also had its origin completely in design for aging and ergonomic maximal flexibility and comfort. And so, this is a kind of story where disability is at this really interesting heart of innovation and design of our very everyday mass manufactured products, but the disability origin has often gone away, right? It's been kind of swept under the history in the arrival of this in our everyday lives. But if you look around your house right now, you'll see universally designed products like this. And the logic of universalism is that if designers go and actually look in the so-called margins of human experience, they gain insight in those margins that apply then in kind of an all ships rise logic. They give you a better mousetrap for the great tent of the middle. So that's where universalism arises. And there's certainly things to celebrate there. I would just offer, though, too, that there's this kind of complete opposite, too, that you could also point to, which is equally exciting. And that is the work of the Adaptive Design Association, which is in a storefront in New York City that builds highly bespoke, one at a time, customized cardboard chairs and furniture for children all over the city of New York. But they also, so they don't scale one widget, to the tune of 100,000 or 1 million. Instead, they have a way of working that is replicable because it uses low-tech materials like Elmer's glue and wooden dowels and cardboard. And because they have a free video library, they do trainings all over the world. They have people come in and do clinics and workshops. They train people to design with this ubiquitous material of cardboard, but precisely and radically for one person at a time. So you can imagine for this 2-year-old boy whose body is going to change in 6 months and a year's time, there's this deep commitment to and attention to what it is that he can and cannot do, what it is he enjoys or not, the precise measurements of what he needs for the support that's going to give him playtime, social time, developmental time. So here is where there's this kind of, in design, we'd call it mass customization. So platforms, and some of this through even digital fabrication. I mean, right now you can customize your jeans or your, sneakers online. So that's a little bit of that mass customization. But this is a kind of radical commitment of design for one for anyone, this kind of replicable way of working, a platform for working. And so it just kind of helps us think differently about only things that can be manufactured like this. These things really matter to us, but disability is also at the heart of this other kind of craft practice that, again, it's in the garment district. You would just walk right by and never know. And it's the land of special education and the helping professions, meaning it's the land of women. And so it tends to be thought of as caregiving and very rewarding work, and never as astounding, radical, sophisticated, and adaptive work. And so there's just a whole missing frame for understanding the making practices that are happening in all kinds of places with all kinds of expertise. And of course, right now you'll see right outside your door the phenomenon of the curb cut, which is shown there on the right. That's a universal design. That's the product of the Americans with Disabilities Act, rolled out at infrastructural scale, this political will, hard one, to alter the built environment at every street corner to make it navigable by wheelchair users. So I'm just showing you some of the history that's so interesting in the 1960s and 70s. One of many leaders is pictured there on the left. That's Ed Roberts, who was a polio survivor and slept in an iron lung at night, had complex medical needs, but lobbied for and went to UC Berkeley, lived in the hospital on campus at Berkeley. And as a result of doing that, welcomed 10 or 12 other wheelchair users onto campus at Berkeley. So it became a site of real disability consciousness raising then in the 70s. And Roberts and others were at the heart of the Bay Area movement that was a big piece of the push to get curb cuts for all of us everywhere. If you go now, and I encourage you to do so, to the Ed Roberts campus named for him at UC Berkeley, you will see this glorious ramp right there in the atrium hall when you walk in. And if you go there, you'll see people on bikes, pushing strollers, walking with small children, and also, of course, in chairs using that ramp, front and center ramp. Even beyond that kind of universal story, and those familiar objects are things that are perhaps unfamiliar. We could think in the realm of architecture of deaf space, which is down at Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C. And Gallaudet is an all deaf and hard of hearing campus, and it was chartered by Abraham Lincoln in 1864, been around a long time with really clever adaptations there historically. Like there was in an old building, there was a somatic doorbell, so that a visitor outside a building would pull a chain and a big weight would drop in a chamber inside. And the somatic feeling of that drop was the doorbell to signal that a visitor was outside. So these like very clever mechanical adaptations. And now if you go to campus, instead of knocking on the door of a staff or faculty member, you flip the light switch on and off, and the light switches are outside the office door. So that's kind of visual signal of a knock. But Deaf Space was a kind of program put into place for the new architecture on campus, and its features you can see here of, the use of wood for its somatic properties. So people will use wood for tapping or slapping to call a group to order. Those are half height walls that you see there because you don't need sound barriers for deaf space, right? You need long sight lines. You need to be able to communicate across at near distances and far distances in the visuality of sign. Those colors on the walls and the upholstery, those kind of medium blues and greens, are great contrast for a number of skin tones for signing. You wouldn't want busy wallpaper or bright white. Everything, there's so many of these features, the kind of widths of the doorway thresholds and so on. I mean, what's interesting is that I conducted an interview right here in this room with interpreters and a number of deaf students, and there's a coffee kiosk like at the end of this little lobby, and these students enjoy music, right, at very, very, very loud volumes because it feels so delicious, right? That way that bass feels on your insides. But it was so loud that it was pleasurable for those students, but I couldn't actually hear the interpreter. So I had to ask if we could go outside so that I could make sense. So in one instant, I was the one disabled by that environment rather than the other way around, and it's wild how quickly that turns. Down the street is the signing Starbucks in Washington, and this is a fascinating place to go, which again I recommend to you. because you, as a hearing person, you go in there and just with a little wipe away tablet, write your name and your order, and your name comes up at the end of the coffee bar on a monitor. So a hearing person and a deaf person can have this interaction with an all deaf staff at the signing Starbucks with no problem whatsoever. And think about how those of us in schools and churches are always saying, how will we ever make this accessible? Oh my goodness, it's going to cost $1 gazillion. How will we ever, how will we ever? And they go like, I don't know, you just get like the tablet and the TV monitor. Like it's at Best Buy, you know what I mean? Like I'm just astonished at the ingenuity of this, like with two little interventions. In my field, we call this service design. So it's like, what are the points of interaction? What happens first and what happens next and what after that? And it's really just the simplest rearrangement of the interactions changes the entire dynamic. And it's a deaf-owned space as a result. And they're planning for a bank and a pizza parlor. And so it's really interesting. This is Steve Sailing, who is the head of the ALS Residence Initiative. And Steve is has an advanced condition of ALS now and is and using a motorized wheelchair. He has a cursor that's on the nose bridge of his glasses that's talking to the tablet that's mounted on that chair. And with it, he can call the elevators and open the doors and, raise and lower the blinds and all kinds of technologically automated tasks in his home. And more than anything, I think this is a really clever design for himself and for other people with ALS and with MS. And the Residence Initiative is, a kind of lobbying group to make better residences for people with ALS altogether. But here again is where assistance is visible and life is worth living. That's actually what's happening here. And, the conversation about ALS, which is a hard diagnosis, no doubt, but the conversation around it tends to be about assisted dying and about, autonomy over that death. That's an important conversation to have. But I just am blown away every time at the way Steve built and designed a life worth living for himself, in part with technology and with a rich ecosystem of human care. And can we imagine ourselves, even in such a hard situation, and I don't sugarcoat it for a minute, but would we have that imaginary for a different kind of relationship to help that we would also call a worthy and desirable life? I just think this is one of the most essential questions. Finally, you may have read about architecture for dementia, which is a whole burgeoning field. It's really fascinating. This is a locked, secure facility in Weesp in the Netherlands, which was the site of a clinic for care in that very standard model, long bay of rooms all in a row with a nursing center in the middle, but was remodeled entirely to be this kind of simulacrum of a village. So you go through two sets of locked doors, but then the site opens up into this plaza in which there's a grocery store and a barbershop and a theater and a restaurant. Because dementia comes with confusion about memory, but also confusion in the form of navigation. So the fact that these designs are highly placeful, meaning they're very specific, you know exactly when you go to the music room because of the images on the walls and the objects that are there, it tells you in very vivid color what's happening here. And the reassurance of this is deeply calming to people who live there. And as a result, the residents rely far less on psychotropic drugs and other kinds of anti-anxiety medication, which is a whole problem in the field, just the over-reliance on pharmacology. And, people have to resort to that, but design, it turns out, can be one form of many for treatment, for helping people live a kind of recognizable, continuous life in a dignified way. In again, a very hard diagnosis. So, design really is everywhere. I mean, there's prosthetics and, flashy technology, but I hope you'll see that, in fact, it's really all around us at all scales. This field is being written about in a really interesting and lively way. So my book joins a whole family tree of scholars thinking about this stuff, its history, and also its kind of everyday appearance in our lives. I would just invite you again to make friends with help. It's what I'm working on all the time too. And that's what I have to present. So thank you so much for your attention. And Christian, maybe we can talk now or see what is on. We could go to gallery view or however you want to do it.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much. That was extremely not only informative, but just provocative in the best way to sort of get us thinking about big questions, but big questions that come at you through sort of small bite-sized adjustments and adaptive, little inventions. I just absolutely love that. I do have my question is a kind of bizarro, like political economy question. I some years ago I helped teach a course that dealt with some philosophy of technology kind of stuff, and so part of the argument in some of the philosophy of technologies is essentially that it's technology and human beings are almost virtually inseparable, and that there's an argument to be made that to be human is to be in one way or another either creating or utilizing some form of techne.
Yes.
Right, some form of that skill.
Yeah.
One of the things though that I thought was really interesting about your opening chapter is this question of the norm and normalcy, and how and I think one of the reasons why I think about this a little bit is my son Elijah, who is not neurotypical. He's neuroatypical. So he's on the spectrum with a kind of a mild form of autism. I'm sure my wife could give it a little bit more precision. Yeah. And but his experience, and him at times feeling like, why is the world so rigid, and how do I fit in? It's kind of part of what I guess kind of got me thinking about this. But it's really more, I suppose, like how does the rise of normalcy and norm as a category, the way that you describe it, how does that connect to the kind of bigger political realities? And I thought, I guess 19th century, it's pretty much the rise of industrial capitalism is what it feels like. And it feels like we're sort of maybe, and part of the narrative it feels like that you're telling is that we're kind of ending in a way. Is it almost like we're emerging from some of that? Or, I mean, I don't know. I don't know if you know what to do with some of those comments, but
yeah,
that's me sort of starting the ball rolling.
No, absolutely. I mean, well, let me just respond to that, it's kind of cyborg theory that you're talking about there at the beginning. And certainly, yeah, people, folks would say, as far back as you look, like from the minute, a human picked up a stick to whack prey on the head in order to survive, like that's an assisted technology moment, right? That's an extended body moment. And I think that's absolutely true. And I also think those conversations almost never say, and look, it's disabled people who would call themselves disabled, who are actually at the forefront of using those technologies in the most adaptive, the most ingenious ways. They would say, well, we're all cyborgs, and then some of us need assistive technology. Do you see what I mean? So like, to me, it's the most important thing is to say, yes, that is true. It is a universal human condition. You should not think of people with disabilities as kind of like back here and like, don't forget, and they need special help. You should think of them as kind of your forefront kind of beacons who are already always adapting in more acute ways all the time, right? So yes, you are using fork and chopsticks, and so that you can join that. But I think it's one of those kind of like political economy questions of like, there's a rights tradition of saying like, okay, we have urgent needs for this kind of extended body. Yes, it's a human condition. And also there are acute barriers that arrive for certain people with, particular needs, but they are out there in front on the sophistication. And I just don't think that's represented in the scholarship outside of disability studies. People tend not to think of those things. As to your later question, yes, indeed. I mean, if basically the social sciences are not that old, that is a kind of the need to kind of measure populations at scale is an industrial one it's a city's kind of problem, right? How many people are represented in X kind of group in order to manage illness and traffic and, workforce development and all of that. And that's good. We need population scale measurements whereby we get averages and means and so on, a little over 200 years old. But what social scientists say that leads to is what's called the aggregate of fallacy, where because we can think at population scale, we tend to think that whatever is in the middle, the kind of precise, beautiful norm average of that population scale is not only average, but desirable, right? So the minute you kind of wed together what's like a numerical average with an aspiration, that's where you get everybody who doesn't measure up as kind of castigated. Moreover, you get by the end of the 19th century, the kind of nationalist movements, xenophobic movements, you get people really organized around, and a kind of misinterpreted social Darwinism. You get people organized around, not only is the average, not only is it good, but we could try to get there. We could try to, right? We could try to weed out the weak links. We could try to, so you see in the United States in the 1920s, at the county fair, right? In rural environments, you'll see fitter families, kind of better, fitter families, these kind of contests whereby families show up to be weighed and measured and to sort of how fit they are for a kind of strong national future, sort of like the way a cow, is evaluated, or a pumpkin is evaluated at the farm. I mean, there is this kind of, and this was a kind of, remember, okay, this was a progressivist kind of movement, right? A kind of like look to the future, a kind of liberatory story of like a better, and that's why, I mean, I have a great aunt that my grandfather never spoke of, who we found in the records after his death was clearly institutionalized when she was 6 or 7 years old. Many of us have that history that we don't even know about, because those families were told at that time, in that better, fitter families kind of nationalist push, you're not equipped to parent this child. And also, right, it's a kind of shame story about they're not carrying the future. And so they have to be managed. But also James Trent, who's at Gordon College for a long time, wrote this book called The Invention of the Feeble Mind. And feeble-mindedness, right, is a category that arises because of economic productivity. If you cannot serve as a productive citizen, as an economic unit, you become feeble-minded. Why? Because able-minded means legible in an economy. That's what it means. So misfitting, atypicality, is not just about falling out of the average in a pure kind of morally free numerical sense. It means falling out of form with being a productive, meaning 40-hour work week tax paying citizen. That's what it means. I mean, this has never been so clear to me as raising a child with Down syndrome. I mean, it's so clear the way that school is entirely organized to see how proximal to normalcy he is. And what that means is how proximal to the verbal production, the mathematical capacity to appear like somebody who could someday have a job so that he could what? Be worthy enough for respect, right? In an industrial culture, because, right, we've all agreed that's where narrative comes in, that's the kind of form of respect that we're going to, hold up. And so all of this, Christian, right, requires us to say, what is a good life? What does it mean, right? And if we believe in the inherent dignity of all people, goodness, what does that mean then for us, for our politics, for our choices, for our, where our energy goes? So what is your response to that, or anybody else's too?
The only thing, I mean, one of the things that struck me rather significantly as you were talking was how much this maps on to sort of the historicist project of someone like a Michel Foucault, right, with the birth of the clinic, the history of madness, and these institutions that are created, but that they're not simply created in response to something. They're created, and in so doing, they actually create the people that they're going to then house.
Right.
Yeah. And that's, I guess that's kind of the first thing that came to my mind in a sense.
Well,
Trent, these big questions.
Yeah, Trent shows this too, that basically you get institutions, because families were, families would be impoverished by having to care for a feeble-minded child in the 19th century. So the institutions were created to kind of, house folks, but that then the idea originally was to then return folks to the community once they were, I guess, trained in jobs or something. But the history has never been that, because, right, the institutions must proceed to perpetuate themselves. I mean, right, they need to kind of expand their role, and they need to justify their existence. But the other thing I think you're pointing to, Christian, and I would be happy to hear other people's thoughts on this, I am really struggling right now with the irony of the medicalization of all of our nonconformity, because now I do also feel like there's a countervailing impulse to it feels liberatory to us to find a label for the things that make us different. But sometimes I think I'm not sure that is liberatory, because it makes nonconformity ever more only, it has to be labeled. It has to have a pathology attached to it, when really I think disability studies is trying to show us that variation is normal. That's the point. Deep humanness includes variation.
Yeah. I would jump in here too, because, as in bringing up Elijah, and also just some of the other work that I do in education, one of the, to your point about like the pathologizing of it. And I think when I work with kids and have in my classroom, and then also with Elijah, as you come to, I think there's an assumption that if some kind of a label is put on a child in terms of like, this is what's going on, that it would be really damaging to them. And I have found that the opposite is often true with kids, and parents. And I understand, because as a parent of a child who has autism and ADHD, the ADHD was something we talked about early, but it came later as he got older that I brought the word autism out, mostly because I didn't want him to hear that and then see some of the almost offensive stereotypes of what being autistic is in the world. And to say, but that's not me, because if you've met one person who has autism, you've met one person who has autism. It can look very, very different. So I didn't want to put that on him in a way, but as he has ingested it and sort of digested what that means and read about it, and he's been reading some of the book by, there's a book by John Elder Robison called, I can't remember what it's called, but anyway, it's basically a biography, and it's like, be who you are, like, be weird. Of course you're different. This is great. And so he read it, and literally as he's reading it, he was like, oh my gosh, this is why I like this. And I was like, yeah. And so then he started actually using that terms of like neurotypes. He's like, well, those people are probably neurotypes, and that's not me. And he kind of owns it a little bit. It's a very proud thing for him, which I think is empowering for him to say, like, there's nothing wrong with you. This is just different. You see the world differently. And whether you feel it right now, that ultimately that your perspective and your own vision of the world around you isn't represented. And he loves film and he loves writing. And we're like, you could tell the world that we need this narrative. We need to understand your point of view. And it's like, it's your gift that you have this. And so I think as he gets older, that, which would have been maybe a box, felt boxing in, maybe ultimately is the thing that will help him. I have identity and pride about that. And so it's the redefining it to him, I think, that helps him define it to himself. And I think, when in speaking about, like, I have a couple, I'm going to talk for just a couple minutes because there's a couple things bubbling. Also, like, in one of my professional developments with my teachers, we read a book. I had them read a book, The End of Average by Todd Rose. I don't know if you've read that book. I would recommend it for anybody who's interested, because it's a very easy read. It's not overly difficult to read, or you don't have to have a deep knowledge in this background to be able to make sense of it. And it just basically talks about the history of how average was created and how it's a myth and there's really nothing true about it. which I think is really liberating. And that was the beginning of a conversation then on advanced differentiation and how do we make classrooms accessible and remove roadblocks so that kids can ultimately show and rise to the very best self, like get rid of the roadblocks that they have, which in school very typically those are more brain development than anything else, I find. And a lot of kids have developmental differences that there is no normal, there's no average in a classroom. And so what you need to do to be able to make it or show who you are or learn or whatever, you might need a whole variety of accommodations or things that help you adapt to that space. So I would say that. And then the final comment I'd make is I had the pleasure of going to the Apple headquarters a couple of years ago before COVID, the big ring thing that they have out in Palo Alto, and got to go in the inner sanctum. It was so exciting because usually you can't get in there. And we had the great opportunity to meet the architect, the head architect who designed the whole thing and also designs all the Apple stores all over the country. And he was talking about, he gave us a tour of the facility and talked about the choices he made, and he's really interested in universal design or creating places that allow for the greatest accessibility. And he said, and so he was talking about his choices and the intention. And he said the greatest compliment he received was from one of the employees who worked there. And I wish I wasn't really surprised, but a lot of the engineers and creative people that work in that space tend to be on the spectrum, tend to have other kinds of might be termed disabilities or things. And there was one man he was talking to, and he said, I really get anxious. I don't want people coming up behind me because I get very absorbed in what I'm doing. If things are too distracting, that's very hard. And work can be a very stressful environment for me. And he and the designer had made all these choices trying to get inside the mind of people that needed a different kind of environment to feel the most peaceful so that they could really, be in their zone. And this gentleman told the designer, he's like, I love being here because it feels so peaceful in this. And like, he pointed to all these design features, and the designer was like, I felt like I had done my job because I had made someone for whom work would have felt very stressful and de-stressing, and it would have eaten into his quality of life. The way that the choices that we made, the designs that we made did the opposite. It made it so that he was extremely comfortable. He felt like this was a place where he could relax and give his whole self. And that was all just, again, in those design choices. And I thought that was so interesting, and seeing how he had designed it very intentionally for all of these accessibility things. So
I love all that. Thank you, Julie. And I think, when you said that about Elijah reading the book, like sort of going, it's me, like being recognized like that. I mean, my hope is that people see, in the material evidence all around them, but then also in these histories that we tend to forget that they're part of a really big story. And I think sometimes when you're trying to deal with your misfitting, I know when Graham was born, I just felt kind of like, where are my people, and discovering the really big history, not just other parents of children with Down syndrome, but going like, oh my God, I mean, my life just filled up with folks who are deaf and blind and use wheelchairs. And that story, of that so recently, right, that people were institutionalized and hidden away and so on, is a really big one. And when you feel like, oh, I'm part of a bigger thing than myself. But the other thing about Apple, I mean, I just think that's so telling, because there's been all this evidence that the open plan office actually is really bad for for concentration and stuff. And it's still kind of that thing that we've designed for like spontaneity and collaboration. Like, it has a logic to it, but then so many people, I think, find there was a whole couple of years where all my design students were making like helmets for privacy, and it was so in the zeitgeist where everybody was going like, how can I get my little, I just need a minute, I need a little cocoon, something. But of course you're talking about something very particular too. But it's just interesting, like what.
Yeah, well, it was so interesting because not only did he design the individual offices so that they had that kind of peaceful atmosphere, but then he said, he said, I need to design so that we have intentional interdependence on one another. I need to design in such a way that makes it impossible for me to do my job well unless I'm talking to 10 other departments. But yet everyone has their sort of proprietary secret work that they're working on as well. So they made rules where they're like, you can't have in your little office nest, you can't have a refrigerator, you can't have anything. You have to come out into the commons. Here's where the coffee bars are. Here's where the bathrooms are. And it's very echoey right there. So you can hear what everyone else is talking about. Like they purposely did all of these things to create that independence and collaboration, but also create then when you go back and your brain is worrying with ideas, can you get into a space where you can allow that creativity to happen too, which was amazing.
That is amazing.
The other thing I'd say about Elijah too is that I remember he heard someone talking on TV about curing autism and about how there's brain like stimulation that they could do to reignite like neural connections that could bring back a sense of sort of like the social, what you might be missing from the social world around you. And they've had some success with it. And someone was talking about, curing autism. And Elijah was incensed, just absolutely 100% incensed. And he was like, I don't need a cure. I am fine. This is just who I am. Why does someone else need to tell me that I need to fix myself so that I'm, part of the world? And he was livid. But I have to admit that when he was younger and first got his diagnosis, I probably would have been someone very interested to hear and be like, oh, so what could they do to help stimulate that brain growth or whatever? Never thinking that I might be robbing him of something really fundamental and intentional about who God created him to be and the gifts that he has to bring to the world. And it was really interesting. Like his anger, I thought he might think it was interesting or have an opinion, but he was angry about it. And that just really, it was, anyway.
Yeah, it's so telling. And I think those kinds of promises are a little bit overblown too, when you think about the complexity of somebody's brain, but it is so, the most telling thing is this rush to the cure. And I think we have so little imagination for thinking like differences are actually openings as well as closures, right? That we all live with a lot of limitations on what we are able to do or not. And again, this is not to flatten, like what Elijah's going through versus Steve Sailing contending with ALS, right? They're not the same. They're very distinctive. They come with very particular challenges. Nonetheless, I feel like we have a failure of imagination often around what's the creativity in addition to the urgency when we're asking for a better world, the creativity that's there too, and that we'd be without. I want to just get to this comment from Michelle in the chat.
I was going to tell you about the chat.
Doing any research on how Indigenous communities treated people who have non-normative bodies before so much of the world was built. So that, it would be impossible, Michelle, to generalize, right? Of course, around in cultures around the globe. I think one big general thing you could say is that one of the ironies of, the Americans with Disabilities Act, for example, is a kind of presumption of individualism that is the vast exception in the world. So that in prior to a kind of industrialized, economic organization of people, you did have communities wherein networks of kin and care were just unquestionable modes of survival, including people who have non-normative bodies, and of course there are very particular traditions and cultures and subcultures wherein certain kinds of disabilities would have been thought of as demonic or, signs of disfavor. Again, you can't generalize, right? You could find any one of these histories, but it is striking that the Americans with Disabilities Act had to redress the built world that arose from a kind of city industrialization that, yes, presumed an unfettered male body, right, moving through the built environment, unencumbered by babies or toddlers, unencumbered by assisting older adults, but sort of worker men. And so the Americans with Disabilities Act had to roll back some of that to say, like, actually, women, wheelchairs, strollers, canes, crutches, these are also part of the human condition, and they also make up the workforce, and they also make up civic space. And so, but all of that, see, even the Americans with Disabilities Act is rationalized, like the degrees that are required for a ramp when you build one are with an idea in mind of a person with unaccompanied in a wheelchair, right? The metric is you have to be able to get through public space on your own unaccompanied. I think we need that, right? Because you can't presume that somebody has a support attendant there all the time. Nonetheless, it speaks to how atomized our society is and how completely atypical that is from the history of humankind. It is the vast exception. So there's something here to contend with, which is just, again, people in the church talk about, maybe you can talk about this, Christian, about the Benedict option and like just trying to contend with modernity and its isolation in general. And I think disability makes that plain in a way we're caught in finally. We need the laws and the mandates to address a condition that's bigger than any legal structure could hold.
Are there other, it looks like Paige, are you leaning for, you got a comment or question?
You always know when I'm leaning for the mute button. I found the section in your book about the cardboard chairs really fascinating. I've been a pediatric nurse for about 10 years, and I have a history of working with people on their not best days, because I worked in pediatric intensive care, pediatric hospice, and now I work as a legal nurse. So I help families who've had significant losses try to plan for what that means economically. So I work with life care planners, housing, redesign specialists. So I feel like I've kind of seen the spectrum of how people handle bodily changes, especially children. And it's interesting going from the hospital setting to the home setting, because families will get a piece of equipment and they'll be trained on how to use it in this very, sterile setting. And then they get home and they kind of find their own ways of making things work, and they have these adaptations. And when I would come into their homes, they would sometimes be kind of embarrassed or say, like, I know this isn't the way that we were taught to do this, or, we rigged up this thing to work this way. And I would be like, you should actually take that back to the therapy team and tell them this worked for me. Maybe it'll work for other families. Yeah. And now it's funny trying to predict how many times is someone going to have to get a wheelchair replaced in their lifetime, and what is their life expectancy. And so it was really interesting hearing you talk about the equipment that is so custom, that's not meant to be replicated, because that's not really what I'm used to. I don't think that's what the healthcare industry is used to. But I have a question about kind of the pandemic and how it's impacted, whether technology has waxed or waned for certain groups of people. And maybe I'm oversimplifying this, but at the very beginning of the pandemic, I was listening to a live stream by one of my favorite artists who is in a wheelchair, Galen Lee. She's from Duluth. And she was talking about how she's seen people in disabled circles ask for exceptions to this rigid world, things like working from home or being able to participate in things through technology. And she said it wasn't until the whole world needed that to happen that was my need met. And so I thought that was an interesting kind of economy of scale, when there's this many people demanding something that was otherwise really personal to her. Suddenly we're there. So are you seeing that happen in other groups, or what have you seen as examples or responses to that?
Yeah, I've seen that a lot. You said it so well, Paige. I just want to say that I put in the chat this effort called Maker Nurse. I know you're talking about end users and families, but I loved this whole initiative out of MIT called Maker Nurse, which is about just seeing the way that nurses are also doing that adaptation, that informal adaptation that you were just talking about. And I do find that people in all professions get very obedient in the face of technologists going like, I'm not really using it the right way, you know better. And I just think like, no, that's that, I see it with my students, right, at 19 years old. And if they're engineering students, then it's like everybody gets very deferential instead of going like, no, why can't it be this other way? So Maker Nurse was this way to go like, look, nurses are all the time rejiggering, the way the wires go around the hospital bed, and let's honor that, as a whole making practice. But yes, I mean, there's this, I mean, Alice Wong, who's a quite visible disability activist, wrote in March 2020, disabled oracles and the coronavirus. She was just kind of like, we've been asking for telehealth, we've been asking for work from home, we've been asking for flex, policies, just as you said. And there was a lot of bitterness, in those 6 months, because it turned out that like on a dime, everybody could switch when they needed to, just as you said. And I was really heartened to see, really creative, like temporal designs. So like, I'm sure you saw this too, the retail, particular hours set aside for seniors to shop. And then people got wise and went like, oh, we should also make these hours for people with compromised immunity. And it's just like an hour, at the beginning of the day. And I thought we should have this every winter. Like it costs nothing. It's this kind of gesture toward the community. And I've certainly seen people mourn kind of the going away of some of that stuff now. They're seeing some of that being rolled back. But I do find, it will be interesting to see, because now Zoom life is with us. I know people who work in hospitals who've said telehealth technology has been there for a long time. It's just been the sheer inertia among doctors about the way things are. And now, it's much more standard. So won't it be interesting in your field and mine to see if in 3 or 4 years, the workforce really does look different, and where healthcare really does look different, because we have this tandem hybrid thing that we can do now.
Yeah.
It's going to be interesting to see. But I think, all of the pandemic thing was like, it turns out that the built world is more malleable than we like to imagine, like the sidewalk could shift its shape pretty quickly. Those little decals of like 6 feet apart could appear overnight when they needed to. So it does make you kind of go like, what else are we saying has to be the way it is?
Yeah. Yeah. That's a really good way of putting it. Yeah.
Yeah. Anything else on people's minds?
From in the room. Here we go. Matt?
Yeah. I don't usually hop in on these kinds of things, but this actually rings very true and very home to me. So my significant other, who may or may not be listening to right now, so I may embarrass her just a little bit, she was diagnosed with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome at a very young age. And she is slowly but surely losing control of her body in little bits and pieces. So she has a weight limit of 5 pounds. She cannot lift more than 5 pounds. She cannot be in most retail jobs or most, day-to-day jobs, because she cannot be on her feet for very long. So she has been told that by the age of 30, she is currently 19, that she will be in need of a wheelchair. So I want to know what your thought is on what would you tell somebody who is more anticipatory about adaptive technology and assistive technology, and what would you kind of give advice to them on?
Yeah. This is such a, human and humane question. And like the fact that you posed it is so meaningful, I think, too. And this is where I think disability collects all of us, right? We are in interdependent relationships with our children, with our partners. I think it's funny that you use the word anticipatory, because I did use that word in describing Steve Sailing, who had ALS, that he was doing a kind of anticipatory design. He was trying to think, okay, he was fully mobile. He knew he would gradually be less mobile, and then he would actually lose mobility entirely. And that's where he thought, okay, well, what is the orchestration? And I must say, speaking of Apple, that the kind of graduated way that he could use a tablet, and this might be relevant for your partner, a tablet, just the drag and drop. I don't think even Apple understood how transformative this was going to be. That drag and drop key commands, that a mouth stick outfitted with a little felted end would be swipeable across that voice activated commands. That out of the box, those Apple products do a huge amount of communications portal work for people who work in information based jobs, right? So I guess I would say the future really is bright for that stuff, meaning multimodal forms of interacting with digital tech. And I would say there's a really inspiring YouTube series called Zabrita Makes It Work, about a woman who in Southern California who works with folks using 3D printers, all kinds of these kinds of, high tech, but very localized adaptations to make just the kinds of things that she wants. So a 3D printed, very bespoke shape to open up doors and so on. So I would just say to your partner that technologically, product speaking, there are options, that she should think of herself as the first expert on her own body, and to think right in terms of that the frustration of wanting to do something and not finding the tool to do it is the moment when design begins, right? And instead of thinking, well, I have to become an engineer in order to do this, you can say, no. I mean, Alex Truesdell, who for a long time ran the Adaptive Design Association, she said to me, I'll never forget this, Sarah, there are lots of people in the world who need better stuff. There's also a lot of people in the world who can make good stuff. She said, you know who's missing is people in the middle willing to go, the status quo isn't good enough. Can you make me something else? And they get people in the workshop and they beg them, tell us where and how to get this better. So I just want your partner to know that each moment that the body is adapting is also an opening and a creativity moment, and also that she can author her own wishes and needs. That is knowledge and wisdom, and it doesn't just belong in the laboratory. You really can ask the world for the things that you, not just that you need, but that you want. You really can.
I've told her very, very similar things, that, just because you have some limitations doesn't mean that life is quote unquote impossible.
That's right.
It doesn't mean that life has to dramatically change
That's right.
just because of a diagnosis. And that's kind of what you were referencing with your son earlier, was
That's right.
your life doesn't have to change because of a medical diagnosis. In fact, it can morph into something that could be even more satisfying later on.
Yeah, well, and I would amend and just say your life does change, in the sense that, Graham, I do think all the time about what happens to Graham when I die. Like that's not a thing that I don't think about, right? And I will never not be thinking about that. But, right, this is the question, the deeply human question, which is to say, what is a life worth living? Part of that is being expanded beyond your ordinary categories and invited to a bigger life inside and out. And Graham has brought me into that expanded life, right? It's not the typical life. There are diminishments, there are losses. And this is what nobody can imagine, there are deep pleasures that would have been unavailable to us. Deep joys that are a direct result of that condition of Down syndrome. And I mean, in the hundreds and thousands, people that we've met, the blessing that he's brought to people, those are very, very real. I don't mean that's like a silver lining. I mean, his life is rich and replete with joy, full stop. And it comes with losses, right? So your partner may need to grieve that too, that we can all hold together our many responses to the things that are, it's, the unbidden in our lives, right? Can we make peace with the unbidden in our lives, as well as the things that we choose? This is the work of a lifetime, I think.
I think we had one more question.
I have.
Is that from Andrea? Go ahead, Andrea.
I was in a special class, and I have a special friend, and we help each other. And her mom taught me to knit, and I love knitting. And I'm not going to get dementia, but my mom did, because I play games, a lot of games on TV or my tablet, my phone, and I love doing things on my tablet, and I love Zoom too.
Yeah.
Being with people.
Yeah.
And I'm learning on different things.
Fantastic. Thanks for saying so. Yeah, the handheld and also the digital, all those tools that, bring us our joy every day. Thank you.
That was great. Well, I think I had a big question, but I think we're kind of here at the very end. it was sort of, and maybe there's like a parting as you know, if you want to take a shot as you're parting off, but it really is this life worth living question that you keep coming back around to. And I suppose I was just gonna, you know, are there two or three things or one thing really that's at the center that you feel like you have learned, you know, through your design work, through your experience, being Graham's mom, you know, and all the wonderful people that you have crossed paths with and that you write about, some of them at least in your book. Is there something, you know, is there one or two things maybe that have helped you navigate that question, which is obviously, it's that I don't know that that's a question that you just have one answer for, you know, it's something that evolves over time. It's something that but are there some things that you have pulled in those experiences? And of course it sounds like we've gotten a lot of that, but maybe you want to, as a kind of closing comment, say something about that.
I mean, I would just say that the philosopher Alistair MacIntyre wrote a series of 4 books about the good life and the role of virtues and practices in a good life. But the last of these 4 big books that he wrote is called Dependent Rational Animals. And that's his description for what it means to be human. But he leads with dependent. And I think somebody in my position could easily become the kind of warrior mama, you know, like on behalf of my child and sort of proclaiming a kind of defense message of his worth. But the bigger invitation actually Christian has been to say, oh, dependence, that actually involves me too, you know, and not cover, you know, that the role of mother so much that I don't actually locate myself in an ecosystem of giving and receiving help. And that dependence, I mean, for MacIntyre, for Christians, I think perhaps above all, that we actually, MacIntyre calls us to recognize the virtues of acknowledged dependence, that is a virtue, you know, and my own sort of need for help has been, I would just say that's been the biggest invitation. Again, it's not the same, you know, as my friends who use chairs. But it is a profound character forming, I want to say, external reality to us that is a description of the human condition, and making peace with that has been a great invitation and joy.
Great. Thank you again. Thank you so much for joining us, Sarah, for speaking with our crew here. Obviously, we're the intrepid few, but I know there are several other folks who are on YouTube who I bet you some of them are regretting not being able to be here to interact with you directly. So,
well, it's great to be here.
Absolutely. Let me say a very quick word as we head out together. So, Lord, we thank you so much for this night. We thank you for Sarah and her work. We pray for her and her family. Continue to bless them and help us, Lord, to take away from this thoughts and challenges to help reframe the way that we view the world and our place in it. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you.
Thank you all. Have a wonderful night. Thanks for being here. And thank you,
absolutely.
Christian.
It's great to see everybody.
Yeah.
And Sarah, I'll if it's okay, I'm going to send you an email follow up and all that kind of good stuff. And thank you so much. This was marvelous.
So fun. So good to see you all. Take good care, everybody.
Good to see you as well. All right. Have a great night. Stay warm.
Bye-bye.